Well, good morning once again. I hope you all have been well. We have all made it to the final talk of our lecture series, Discovering al-Andalus, the Art and Architecture and Cultural Legacy of Islamic Spain. As always, I would like to thank each one of you for making your way here on these Friday mornings, especially on mornings like this that are kind of rainy and gloomy and slick outside. But I also want to thank you because as a group, we have journeyed far and long to reconstruct this moment of history from Spain's past. I continue to thank you for your attention and passion to learn, and I'll be honest, I'm a little sad that this is the last meeting of this particular series. Nevertheless, it has been an immense privilege to have been able to provide such an enthusiastic group with a lens or several lenses to begin to look at the history of Muslim Spain. We ended our last session last week with a discussion on Madinat al-Zahra, the Umayyad palace city built near Cordoba by Abdurrahman III. Madinat al-Zahra's construction represented a zenith in Hispano-Umayyad history. Part of that golden age of Andalusi history included the proliferation of a unique and specific Hispano-Umayyad Islamic art and architecture. However, this epoch of Hispano-Umayyad glory was short-lived. Before I speak about the fall of the Umayyads of Spain, I would like to reiterate the historical timeline of al-Andalus that we have been working on during these sessions. So, in 711, we learned that the military leader sent by the Umayyads who were in Damascus, named Tariq bin Ziyad, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, which has been named after him, Jabal at-Tariq, or the Mountain of Tariq, so Gibraltar, and defeated the Visigothic armies and the last king of the Visigoths named Roderick. This army was able to take over most of the Iberian Peninsula in a short amount of time and form a new territory to which they gave the name al-Andalus. In 716, the Muslim armies established Cordoba as the new capital of their new land. Governors appointed by Damascus continued to come and rule over the Iberian Peninsula, and they also continued to consolidate their rule over the various conquered cities of Spain while conducting raids across the Pyrenees in southern France, where they remained for some time. And as we learned in 732, Charles Martel is able to stop one of these raids in which the advancing general is also killed in that combat. And after that moment, the Muslims lose their foothold in southern France and don't really venture across the Pyrenees, but rather start to settle down in al-Andalus and create colonies and create agricultural communities and create cities. In 750, another important date, in the Central Islamic lands, big changes happened. The ruling Umayyads that were ruling from Damascus were overthrown by a rival dynasty who claimed the right to rule the Muslims of the entire Islamic world, which at this time was stretching all the way to the borders of China and India and all the way to Spain. The Abbasids, this regime that overthrew the Umayyads, sought to also obliterate the remaining family members of the Umayyads because they were worried that even if one member could lay claim to a future throne, that would be a dent in their legitimacy. Among these last remaining Umayyad princes was a young man named Abdurrahman who escaped the Abbasids and the forces pursuing him, and as we learned, he crossed a river in Iraq and literally escaped with the neck on his hair, and he traveled from the Central Islamic lands to North Africa, and finally in 755 he landed in Spain. Abdurrahman, during this time, he crosses over, and in 756 he's able to defeat the existing armies in Spain with a group of loyal troops and followers. He enters Cordoba and makes it the capital for a new emirate, a new Umayyad emirate in the west, and he spends most of the remainder of his lifetime and his reign consolidating power and trying to unite all of al-Andalus under the government of Cordoba. He is also known in 786 for constructing the first model of what we see today of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which remains the most glorified religious monument in the history of al-Andalus throughout the Umayyad period and the subsequent historical periods of Muslim Spain. Under him, Cordoba becomes the cultural capital of Muslim Spain and the center of all types of artistic productions, some of which we saw last week, as a result of the Umayyad seat of power being located there. And in 788, after a 32-year reign, Abdurrahman I dies. He leaves behind the rule of the Kingdom of al-Andalus to his offsprings, who rule the emirate and continue a dynastic line of the Hispano-Umayyad rulers of Spain. And several rulers emerge after Abdurrahman and continue to develop the Hispano-Umayyad court and other parts of Spain ruling from Cordoba. And now we turn to Abdurrahman III, Muhammad Abul Mutarrif al-Nasir. So in 912, the 8th Umayyad ruler, Abdurrahman, takes the throne, and he brings the Umayyad dynasty to its zenith. In this year, in 929, after being on the throne for 17 years, he makes a drastic shift in his own stature and his own claim to legitimacy over the Muslim world. He assumes the title of Caliph, which enabled the Hispano-Umayyads to become a world force, because they acknowledge themselves as that, in the Islamic world, rivaling two caliphates that were emerging at the same time. So the Abbasids were there since the 750s. They were ruling as the caliphs from the Central Islamic lands. And around this time, in 909, a new Shiite or Shi'i dynasty had emerged in North Africa called the Fatimids. And then in 936, Abdurrahman III, with this new assumed title of Caliph, decides to build a separate palatial city, a palace city, which he names Medinat al-Zahra, which we discussed in detail last week. And the construction, and in this city, he builds a grand complex of royal residences and palace or palatial administrative structures. And the construction of the city and its development continues for the next 40 years throughout his reign and the reign of his son, al-Hakam II. Medinat al-Zahra, like Cordoba, also becomes a center for artistic production, culture, scientific discovery. And during its existence, this is when we call the Umayyad Spanish history a golden age. And our sessions up till now have taken us up to this point in history. We have discussed the agricultural, artistic, and agricultural advancements which took place all over the Iberian Peninsula during this moment of history in the 10th century. We discussed the expansion and ornamental beautification of the Great Mosque of Cordoba during the reign of Abdurrahman III's successor, al-Hakam II, who, as we saw in previous lectures, extended the mosque's southern wall and commissioned the beautiful mosaic prayer niche, or the mihrab, and the dome and the polylobed arches in the front of the mosque, which are still visible for us today. And now it's going to get a little fun. So if any of you spent time watching Dynasty on TV, you shouldn't have done that. You should have really focused on Hispano-Umayyad history, because things are going to get a little dicey. So in 961, Abdurrahman dies and his son al-Hakam becomes caliph, as we said, and he does the renovations and the extensions of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Al-Hakam rules, and he is also perpetuating this golden era of Hispano-Umayyad history. But when he dies in 976, he leaves behind a young heir named Hisham II, who is the next caliph, but this caliph, this young son, is only 11 years old. Al-Hakam II, after his death, this is when the dynasty's decline begins to unfold. Al-Hakam had married a Christian woman from Pamplona, located in and Pamplona was in the Christian kingdom of Navarre in northern Spain. And she was likely brought to Cordoba as a slave of war, a prisoner of war, and then married al-Hakam II. Her name was Aurora, but likely she must have converted to Islam. So in the Arabic sources, we know her as Subh, which means dawn in English. Together, the Caliph and Subh had had Hisham II, and as I said, when al-Hakam died, he was only 11 years old. So at that moment, Subh takes control, and she acts as a queen regent on behalf of her son, looking out for his interests and trying to ensure that none of the uncles or cousins try to lay claim to the throne. And in order to do this, she joins alliances with a member of the court named al-Mansur bin Abi Amir. And he is a general, he's a military figure, he's very powerful, and Subh joins alliances with him to ensure that power is not taken away from her young son. And the idea was that al-Mansur would represent the caliph, and then eventually when the caliph came to age, give him the power back. Al-Mansur bin Abi Amir, or al-Mansur, and in the Latin text we know him as al-Mazur, he acted as what we call in the Arabic political vocabulary as a hijab, and a hajib. And hajib literally means the person who closes the curtain. So if you think of the word hijab, it sort of means something that veils. So if you think about it, a curtain or a drapery is also called a hijab. So somebody who would close it and open it would be a hajib. And this name comes from court ceremony because often or not, if the caliph was seated in the throne, he would often, if courtiers came or people came, they weren't always allowed to see the caliph up front, so they would close a curtain to sort of conceal him, to raise his authenticity and his authority. The theatrics of optics in political power is something that is very developed to a high extent in the Umayyad court. So this word hajib basically comes from there. Obviously, that's not his only job to open and close his drapes. As I told you, he was a general. But the idea is that one of the higher members of the state assumes this role because it's a role of honor. And the equivalent in understanding what this role is if we can call it a chamberlain, or in many ways a chancellor of some sort, so the supreme chancellor, someone who all the other ministers would have to talk to, and he becomes the intercessor or the liaison between the caliph and the people. So al-Mansur basically assumes this great position on account of Subh, and he starts protecting the realm so that when Hisham II would rise to power, he would give it back to him. Now, al-Mansur ends up ruling as the de facto ruler. So what did the hajib actually mean at this point? When you have an 11-year-old, I have a 10-year-old, so I know that you can actually use reverse psychology to let the 10-year-old know they're in power, but I know who's calling the shots. At least I think I do. So, in other words, since Hisham was only 11 years old, al-Mazur or al-Mansur becomes the sole de facto ruler of al-Andalus at the time. Now, if any of you were here for the last time I spoke, this is the same individual who raids Galicia. So he continues a series of raids into Christian territories in the north, and he sacks Santiago de Compostela, and it's a very interesting development that when he comes back, he basically enlarges the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So this is how it was up till al-Hakam's time. This is the new mosaic dome and prayer niche, but then he extends it to the east. And one of the reasons he did that was to assume power. He invites many North African Berbers to come and start living in Cordoba. And as a result, the population of Cordoba increases and more space is needed in the mosque. So he's responsible of enlarging the mosque, and also what he does is he's legendarily known for bringing back the bells of Santiago on the backs of Christian captives so that they can be hung in this great mosque. So he would have hung them still in the central aisle. As ornaments or trophies of war, as lamps. And we don't have any extant lamps of this period from the Umayyad period left in Spain, but we do have them from subsequent periods from the 12th and 13th century that still hang in mosques in North Africa as bell lamps. So other rulers emulating Cordoba, because Cordoba had become a cultural center, would bring bells back from conquests in Spain, bring them across the Straits of Gibraltar or to other mosques in Spain, and also continue to copy the Cordoban model and create these bell lamps or lamps made from Christian bells. They didn't melt the bells were intact, and they would copy this or emulate this tradition, which in the sources, the earliest known example that we have is Al-Mansur's bringing back the bells of Santiago. Now, one other fact about Al-Mansur is that likely on the account of his alliance to the Queen Regent Subh, who we said was from Pamplona, from Navarre, the northern kingdoms of Spain, which had not been colonized by the Muslims and had remained largely Christian. So in 992, Al-Mansur struck a peace treaty with the king of Navarre, who was named Sancho Abarca. And to officially agree to that treaty, Sancho gave Al-Mansur his daughter to wed. So we have another example of a figure from the north coming and wedding in the Umayyad court. So we don't think of this period as completely isolated. There were royal family members going back and forth, peace treaties being kept, and communication of all type being done at the political level. And as we know, if it's being done at the political level, then other exchanges of ideas and communication at the micro levels is also occurring at the same time. And so Sancho's daughter and Al-Mansur had a son, and this is where if any of you guys have seen Game of Thrones, it gets a little interesting because they named their son Abdurrahman. Now, he also is known in the historical text as Sanjul, which was the Arabic derivative of Sanchuelo, that was more Italian, Sanchuelo, or Little Sancho, because he was named after his grandfather. It is obvious why Al-Mansur named his son Abdurrahman, because he had no intention to give the kingdom back to Hisham II. And Hisham was confined to Medina to Zahra as a prisoner, while Al-Mansur led the kingdom until his death in 1002. Al-Mansur was succeeded by his elder son, Abdul Malik al-Muzaffar, who also ruled in Hisham II's name as a hajib or a chancellor. Abdul Malik dies in 1008, and instead of giving back the kingdom to Hisham, who is now adult by this time, little Sancho, or Sanchuelo, or Abdurrahman, attempts to seize power for himself as the caliph. And so we shift from the Umayyad dynasty to what historians call the Amirid dynasty, because his name was Al-Mansur bin Abi Amir, so it became the children of Amir now assume control. So he was trying to create his own dynasty. Little Abdurrahman, or little Sancho, fails at doing this. And what happens is that in his attempt to seize power, a civil war breaks out in Umayyad Spain. And this civil war was devastating. It brought ruin to the great achievements brought by Abdurrahman I and his successors. And it also led to, between 1009 to 1013, to the sacking and destruction of Medina to Zahra. So the troops during the civil war came to Medina to Zahra, and they went to the palaces, they detached the marble, They took out the existing structures. They stole the treasure. They entered the treasuries, and the city was left in destruction. And this is one of the reasons which explains why we have a capital from Madinat al-Zahra in our museum today, is because at that point in time, Madinat al-Zahra and its riches and treasures were dispersed. Some of them were left in situ there, and later dynasties come and visit this, and then also further disperse this legendary city across Spain. And what literally happens is that it gets buried under the earth and gets forgotten. Now, after the Civil War, what happens is the emirate, or the caliphate of Cordoba, so all of this territory in green was al-Andalus. And as we said, this whole territory between 755 or 756 to around 1000 created a golden age in the history of Spain. Renowned for, as I said before, for its advancement of culture, technologies, agriculture, art, and architecture. But after the fall of Madinat al-Zahra and the Civil War, this was no more. Umayyad Spain had fallen. And attempts to reinstate an Umayyad heir to the throne failed in the subsequent years. And as a result, al-Andalus splits into more than 20 small independent kingdoms. So the kingdom of Toledo becomes a separate kingdom. Seville becomes a separate kingdom. Cordoba, Granada, Almeria, Murcia, Valencia, and all the other small ones all become separate kingdoms ruled by separate mini dynasties, often divided by ethnic differences. So the Spanish Umayyad court had brought in slaves that were Germanic and French because there was a lot of activity. So many times European slaves were made into powerful factions of the private palatial military. So many of these kingdoms were ruled by certain groups, which we call in Arabic the Saqaliba, which is the Arabic word for Slavic people, which didn't really mean Slavs of Eastern European descent by that time. It meant anyone coming from Europe. And so many of those courts were ruled by Muslim Saqaliba. They were all Muslim, and they were ruled by Berbers, they were ruled by Arabs, but all of Al-Andalus becomes fragmented. And this time in history, we call the history of the muluk, the kings of the Tawa'if, or the better word for it, the translated word that is popular in historical texts, is the party kings. They weren't named the party kings because they liked to party, although they did that too, and they loved music. And each of these courts were created as little emulation courts of the court of Cordoba. But these party kings were named party kings because they were all individual factions or regimes that made a whole of what Al-Andalus would be for the next few centuries. And this political fragmentation of Islamic Spain was matched in the north with the political unification of the northern Christian kingdoms. And as a result, these kingdoms are often in treaties with each other. They're always being ruled and then given off to offsprings and split up. But then there's periods of unity between these kingdoms. There's periods of disunity, and also there's also, because of these three states of the party kings that are bordering, there's also treaties and agreements being made north and south as well, as long as west and east. And as a result of the fragmentation of Umayyad al-Andalus, the Christian north becomes strong. And the 11th century marks the rise of the Kingdom of Castile, and their Christian, or because they're a Christian state at the time, their military advance from the north to conquer Muslim Spain, signaling the start of the period known in history as the Reconquista. And we can go into the merits of calling it a Reconquista or not calling it a Reconquista, but we all understand that what the word Reconquista means. And the most significant turn of events during this 11th century was the fall of Toledo under Alfonso VI of Castile in 1086. And I truly wish we had more sessions to go into this second phase of Andalusi Islamic history, and hopefully one day we can perhaps discuss the development of Islamic art and architecture during this period and the subsequent periods of the North African Al-Muravid and Al-Mohad dynasties that come across the Straits of Morocco to help these party kings try to push back the advance of the northern Christian kingdoms in southern Spain and al-Andalus. But what I would like to dedicate the rest of today's final session is on our final point of the lecture series, which is the legacy that the Umayyad sultans left behind, the Umayyad caliphs left behind in Spain. So, one of the key features that we have repeated throughout these sessions is the horseshoe arch that was adopted by the Muslims and reincorporated in their existing architecture, and also the red and white alternating voussoirs, the frame called the alfiz that frames these arches, and these architectural features become constant in Muslim architecture. And as we know from when Abdurrahman built the mosque in 786, this architectural feature is constant, and it was present from the very beginning. Now, it wasn't and now we'll come to the point of the idea of convivencia, because that was a strong point pushed by scholars that all these communities living in Spain under Muslim rule were living together in peace and harmony, and that created an exchange of ideas, an exchange of artistic and visual culture, an exchange of people and intermarriages and intermingling that created a unique Andalusi identity. Now, as we know, that there were periods of friction, there were periods of rigidity, there were periods of fluidity, and what I think we should take away from this is not that the merit of how true convivencia is, but should we still apply it as a lens to look back at the Islamic history of Spain? And I think we can say yes, that there was a value, there was a shared culture, there was an appreciation, or sometimes just an acknowledgement or understanding of the art and architecture produced by Islamic Spain. It was not a complete rejection. And so the next examples that I'm going to bring are all visual culture, mainly from the Kingdom of Castile, which shows the continuance of Islamic architecture in northern Spain after the Reconquista occurs and the Christian armies keep on coming south. And mainly we're going to be focused on Toledo. But before we go there, let's talk about a manuscript that was created in the time of the Umayyad Caliphate. This is the Beatus manuscript. This particular one behind me is from the 10th century, about circa 945. It is in the Morgan Pierpont Library in New York. This manuscript was written by a monk. Not this particular one, but the original book was written by a monk named Beatus of Liébana in Spain, who lived between 730 and 785. The book is a commentary on the book of Revelation, or the New Testament's Apocalypse of John. And it's one of the best known examples of Mozarabic art. So the Mozarabs, the Musta'rabun, or the like Arabs that were living as Christians in Muslim territories during Umayyad rule. It's one of the examples that we have that shows that they were very aware of the Muslim art and architecture that was surrounding them. And this particular manuscript from the 10th century was created in Tabara, which is in Zamora, so it's very north in Spain, and quite far from Cordoba. And what we see here in this particular folio is the heavenly Jerusalem. So these are the apostles, around the 12 apostles, and the lamb and an angel. And what you can see here is a deliberate attempt when they're drawing the heavenly Jerusalem to depict it using the existing urban architecture that they saw. So what do we see here? We see the use of horseshoe arches surrounded by a frame. They've even made a deliberate attempt to show pillars holding up the arches. And what makes this uniquely Islamic and not Visigothic are the use of the crenellations on the top, which is very common of Islamic architecture. And you can see them on the top of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So these are the crenellations going across. If we look at another miniature from the same manuscript, it's a depiction of the King Nebuchadnezzar who's sieging Jerusalem. Again, the city of Jerusalem is depicted with a gate that has a horseshoe arch, with niches surrounding the gate, which is very common of Islamic architecture. You can see here red and sort of red lines that indicate the alternating red and white stone voussoirs. And again, what makes it more obvious is the crenellations crowning the entrance of the city of Jerusalem. And if there was any doubt that they were emulating or they were depicting Islamic architecture, in this particular folio, which depicts the Feast of Balthazar, you can see that they have consciously used a marbled pillar with a alternating red and white horseshoe arch covering the court of Balthazar, who is, again, having a feast, laying down on a pillow and eating from a basket or a bowl of some sort. Again, they are trying to depict what their imagination of the Umayyad court of Cordoba might have been. Again, in the depiction of the whore of Babylon, we see again that the whore of Babylon, who has been defaced later, she is wearing a crown. You can tell that the clothes that she's wearing are embroidered, and she is seated on a cushion, and she's seated cross-legged, which is very much the way that an Islamic ruler would be depicted in carvings and other works of art at that time, which also tells us about the portability of objects that they were reaching as far as Tabara, or at least reaching the visual vocabulary of the artists of this particular 10th century manuscript. What other art historians have pointed out is that the artist has also gone out of his way to depict a crescent on her crown, which is inverted and upside down. But again, the crescent has a unique position in the Islamic art of the entire Muslim world at that time. It's not an emblematic symbol of Islam at the time, but the crescent that is in this shape has a meaningful value that is seen in pieces of Islamic art and architecture, usually as a surmounting emblem, not representative of Islam as a whole that we see today. That's a later Ottoman development, but it is very significant that the artist has put it in the crown of the whore of Babylon. And again, in the picture of the fall of Babylon, again, you can see that, again, it is a city with horseshoe arches, with niches that are in the horseshoe shape, very much like the niches that we would see in Islamic architecture of the 10th century. And again, to reinforce this notion are the crenellations above the gate. And what this type of art is called many times is the Mos-Arabic art, because this is art that of Christians living under Muslim rule. And another example that we have is a treatise of Ildefonsus, Ildefonsus was a bishop of Toledo between 606 and 667. He was a Visigothic bishop, and he's later sainted. But he wrote several treatises, and one of them in this depiction, this is a later copy of his 7th century works. This one is from 1067, so 20 years before the fall of Toledo, but still done by a Mozarabic artist. You can see again that the horseshoe arch is very important, but again, in addition to the horseshoe arch is what would likely have been their perception of the stucco ornamentation that decorated the arch. Again, you see crenellations on the top, and in the middle of this arch is a royal scene with the angel Gabriel and Mary enthroned. And you can actually see Maria here and Angelus Gabriel here. And this type of appreciation of Islamic art continued throughout the presence of Muslims in the peninsula. What we have here is the Kennicott Bible that's in the Oxford Bodleian. It is much later, it's from 1476, but it is one of the most lavish illustrated Hebrew Bibles that still exists. It was produced in Spain. We know that the scribe of this particular Bible's name was Moses ibn Zabara, and it was produced in La Coruña, which is in Galicia, Spain, so very much in the north. The Bible has the entire Tanakh, or the Old Testament, and it also includes a grammatical treatise of the Old Testament, which I believe is called the Sefer Michol. What is interesting about this manuscript, and I haven't brought the original manuscript here, this is actually a picture of the facsimile, but the original manuscript has 238 illuminations. It exists, so the entire manuscript is 922 folios, and 238 of those folios are illuminations. So we're talking about 25% of this Hebrew Bible is illustrated. And we are lucky to know that in the colophon, the artist is also named. His name was Joseph ibn Hayyin. And if you look closely at the depictions, what you see here is very much like a carved arabesque stucco decoration, a vegetal ornament that you would see very much like the wall panels of the Salon Rico at Medinat al-Zahra. Again, in other pages of the Bible, you can see the horseshoe arch is deliberately used as a framing device for the writing. Other pages have clear geometric depictions that would have been seen in the art and architecture of Muslim Spain, and also find themselves in Islamic manuscripts and Islamic Qur'ans as frontispieces or carpet pages. You would not see dragons in the Islamic book, but these types of geometric designs are very common. And when we speak about legacy and thinking about Muslim Spain's visual culture and the perpetuation of that, one of the most vibrant contributions of Islamic culture and Islamic art generally around the entire Islamic world is the proliferation and dissemination of ceramic technologies, and in particular, in the time period that we are talking about, the 10th century, lusterware. So lusterware, and so these two bowls behind me are actually Fatimid bowls from the 10th and 11th century. The reason I don't have any examples from Muslim Spain is that the lusterware actually appears in Muslim Spain in the 11th century, but the technology was created in the 10th century in the Islamic world in Baghdad. So the Abbasids had created a technology for creating this sheen or luster on bowls. And if any of you get the chance to go to the DMA and you see these bowls on display, I believe that they probably should still be there. Take a look right and left and let the light move as you move. And what you'll see is there's this pearlescent sheen that covers the entire, these bowls, and you can kind of see it here. And so how did they achieve this? These vessels would be first made and fired, and they would be covered with an opaque glaze. So then you would just receive the bowl, And then they would create another material, another medium, which was either mixed with silver oxides or copper oxides. And they would use this medium and then repaint a design on top of that existing bowl. And then, and this was not as easy as it looks because you'd have to get the temperature right. And so they would actually put the bowl in for a second firing in a reducing kiln. And at that time, the chemical reaction, what would happen is that from these silver oxides or copper oxides that they use, the oxygen would be drawn out. And metal particles would just be left. And those metal particles would suspend themselves to the surface of the vessel, thus creating this sheen. So the golden brown design, if it's more on the brown side, it's usually from the copper. And if it's more on the green side, it is from the silver. Now, this technology, if we can call it a technology, arrives to Spain in the 11th century, and then after these party kingdoms start to fall one by one, in the 13th century, when James the Conqueror takes Valencia, Malaga had already been a center for ceramic production, and when Valencia is taken, Manises in Valencia becomes a ceramic center during this later period, and all the way up to the 15th century, it becomes an exporter of lusterwares across the world. And so, again, this is another example where the brown is used, and there is also it's luster over a blue and opaque white glaze from the 15th century. This is another example. This is Spanish albarello or albarello, and it comes from the Arabic word likely albarada, which is a jar to keep water cool. It's an earthenware, it's painted in blue, and then there's luster over an opaque white glaze. And this is also made from Manises, Spain, at the beginning of the 15th century. And in the 15th century, the 14th and 15th century, second half of the 14th century, we have our famous Alhambra vases that are using the same idea and the same technology, tin glazed lusterware with blue paint. And these are quite tall, 135 centimeters tall. And the diameter is 68 centimeters. So both Christians and Muslims have used this practice, and it uniquely becomes Spanish. And what that does is Mallorca, or it becomes Mallorca ware that gets exported from Spain to other places. So especially the Kingdom of Naples was very keen in importing this type of Mallorca ware from Spain. And so what we have here, this is a jug. It has an accompanying bowl as well. That is a tin glazed earthenware with copper luster. And it was produced in Manises in Valencia between 1465 and 1475. It was produced for the Bartoli family because it has their coat of arms on it. So it was actually transported from Spain to Italy, where it was a very prestigious or aristocratic tradition that you would have your coat of arms on Mallorca ware coming from Spain. And of course, the bowl that we have in the, or the Hispano-Moorish charger that we have in our galleries here at the Meadows is a continuation of that tradition. It's a lusterware ceramic, and here also, if you want to see the gleam of the luster, you can actually go and into the galleries and see that pearlescent finish that the luster creates on this bowl. This one is from the 16th century, and you see these types of bowls being produced up till now in Spain as well. And this appreciation went beyond. And it wasn't just items or objects being taken in the many battles that incurred in the Reconquista. Some objects of completely Islamic origin and Islamic style were used for royal purposes in the courts of Castile. This particular item behind me is a pillow, a silk tapestry pillow, and it was a weave produced in the 13th century, and it was found amongst the burial items of Queen Berenguela, who was the daughter of Alfonso VIII. She was buried in the Castilian royal tombs at the monastery of Santa Maria la Real de las Huelgas de Burgos, which was founded in 1187. And cushions like these were common to be placed in the grave of the deceased. And this one particularly was made in a Muslim workshop. So, and what is interesting is the medallion in the center. What we have are two court figures, what we call qayan, or dancing girls. So one is playing a tambourine while the other one is dancing. This was a common motif that you see embroidered, woven into, this is a gold thread in the back as the surface for this decoration or this ornament within this pillow. And what is most interesting is that often or not in this time period when Christians are using these materials, they often take an inscription that is just mean to, that just has words of joy and bliss. But this one actually has the whole shahada. So it's you can actually see it clear here, La ilaha illallah, which we see on the coins before, that there's no God but God. So they are using these materials in burials and practices because of the value attributed to them. And when we talk about inscriptions, and we look at Castile during this period of the 12th century, Toledo, as I said before, was taken in 1086. So it takes a while for the visual language of inscriptions to disappear from coins and to disappear from what we would consider daily ritual objects or objects of life. So this is a tombstone, and tombstones are real fun to study as material culture because they often tell you how the people, in what languages the people were reading and what they actually visually perceived at the time. In this, it's a tombstone for Michael, son of Semeno, and the Arabic inscription, which starts from here, basically has the Bismillah. So here you can see Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. It was God's foreordainment that the date was fixed for the death of Michael. And then in the Latin, it says sort of the same thing, I think starting from here in nomine, and I think this might be an abbreviation for Christ. And then here's his name, Michael Semeno, that we can see here. So these types of bilingual inscriptions are seen in all these locations where various cultures shift between Arabic culture to a Latin culture. So we see similar tombstones in Norman Sicily that are actually trilingual with Greek or quadrilingual with Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin together. And again, the coinage doesn't change overnight. So when Castile is taken and Alfonso VIII rules between 1158 to 1214, he rules up to 1214. What they mint is a marabatino, which is basically a coin that is supposed to emulate the coins of the North African conquerors that have come across the straits, the Almoravids. And so they make their coins look very much like the golden coins that are coming across. And so you don't have the same religious language in the coins, but you have his name and the date that it's minted, and in this one we know that it was minted in Toledo. And I will end with two buildings, and this one is a glorious church from the 13th century, San Roman in Toledo. It was built in the mudehar style, so this is a new term, mudehar. And what mudehar means is that it was built by either Muslim or Christian craftsmen or Muslim craftsmen living in this newly conquered area, because people didn't just get up and leave. They were there, and so many of the forms, at first the term would be employed for like the idea that all of these Muslims were captives and slaves living in Christendom. That was never the case. The peace treaties, when cities capitulated, often gave Muslims rights to certain areas. When Toledo capitulates, in fact, the Muslims are allowed to keep their mosque, the central mosque, for 2 years. And then, against Alfonso VI's wishes, the chronicles tell us that then it was converted into a church. In these places, Muslim craftsmen and artists still continue their work in the Mudehar style, and often they would use that to build churches. So what we see again in this church has 3 naves that are separated by horseshoe arches, framed by an alfiz. And the capitals are reuse of Visigothic capitals. And the walls also have murals. And the murals basically are of 3 subjects. They're the 4-winged evangelists, the archbishops of St. Stephen and St. Lawrence, and then there's an angel scene which shows the final judgment. And what you can see is that around these frescoes, they have made a deliberate attempt to make the polylobed arch with arabesque decorations and then inscriptions. And these inscriptions actually, we can read them, and they say, joy and bliss all around. And this is actually a common inscription that was it's not only used because it's a Christian building, it was used on a variety of objects in the Middle Ages, because the idea is that the person viewing becomes the intercessor between the joy and bliss that this writing is supposed to emit, and then the viewer absorbs that. Again, you can see this type of stucco pattern, geometric window laced screens. Very distinct use of the horseshoe arch with the red and white alternating. I believe in this case it might be painted rather than an actual voussoir technique. Here's a close-up on the inscriptions. On the top there would have been an inscription in Latin. So what you can see here is a effortless combination of different styles being put together. When they saw it, it seems peculiar to us today, but it wasn't as peculiar to a 13th century audience in Castile. And those are the questions that we have to ask of what convivencia actually means. Again, you can see that they've made a deliberate attempt to create an arabesque design in the arches. And like the San Roman, in Toledo we have another building. So in Spain, we know that there were 4 Sephardic Jewish synagogues from the medieval period on the Iberian Peninsula. 3 of them have been made in the Mudehar style. And the one that I'm going to show you today is Santa Maria la Blanca, which was constructed in around 1180 at the end of the 12th century. Santa Maria la Blanca is the name of the church that the synagogue was converted into in 1405, between 1405 and 1411. But originally in the 12th century, this building was built as a synagogue, and we do believe that it was built by the finance minister of Alfonso VIII of Castile. His name was Joseph bin Mir bin Shoshan. And many people have argued that this might be the oldest synagogue in Europe. What is interesting about this synagogue is, again, the decoration is very much echoed off of the Islamic decoration that would have would have been disseminated in Spain at the same time. So again, you can see stucco design work, but you can see the polylobed arches between the ceiling and the horseshoe arches that make up the building. But what is also interesting about this particular building is that it is a hypostyle type building, which is not very common in synagogue construction at the time. So by hypostyle, I mean that it has several pillars, and all of these pillars are separated by horseshoe arches, which creates several aisles in the synagogue. And again, other views of it, we can see stucco decoration, geometric decoration with foliage in between, very common Islamic practices and styles. And so we are back. What is interesting is that we talk about the legacy. And from the moment that Madinat al-Zahra was covered in 1011, what happens is that it doesn't get rediscovered, it just becomes a memory in time, but not even a memory in the Spanish history. And that is because in the 16th century, Spain was split with different intellectual ideas, because by 1492, the last Muslims had departed from, the Muslims were still there throughout the 16th century, but 1492 marks the fall of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada and the handing over of the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Castile. And what this left us was a split after that of intellectualism in Spain, which became very much a mixed issue between conservative thinking and liberal thinking, if you want to simplify it. But that one angle of thinking saw the Muslim period as not an extension to the Spanish national identity, but an occurrence that happened for plus 700 years. And it did not see it as part of the whole of Spanish identity. While another group thought that, no, this 700 years was very much part of the Spanish tradition. But as a result, there was not much work being done in Spain at all on the Muslim period. Not academically, not archaeologically. Even in the 18th and 19th century, Europe started getting a strong interest in archaeology. But they were not interested in the Islamic past, because at first they were mostly interested in the Greek and Roman past, which created their own heritage, or the heritage that they identified with. And if it was Islamic, they would go to the Near East, so they were more interested in going into the Middle East and discovering things right there in the Middle East. And I want to take us back to our first lecture then, on the idea of Orientalist paintings and the idea of this group of painters that spur an imagination of a past, an imagination of a culture that once existed, and whether or not they were relaying it correctly or incorrectly, in many ways they were creating a romanticized version of this Islamic past. So this is the final, it's the final scene in the history of the conceived Orientalist history of Spain, of the Nasrid family leaving the Alhambra because they've been defeated, and that's Bobadil probably bowing to his mother, who is shaming him for not having been able to protect the Alhambra and Granada from this onslaught of Ferdinand and Castile. What is interesting that the artist is Manuel Gomez Moreno Gonzalez. He lived all the way up to 1920. He was an Orientalist artist, and he was also a part-time archaeologist. And he trained in Rome at the at one of the royal academies in painting, but he'd also taken his son with him. And his son was Manuel Gomez Moreno Martinez. And he's a later figure in what I want to talk about, but Martinez also is a very important figure in the birth of the rebirth of Islamic archaeology in Spain. He spent a lot of time as a struggling academic, fighting bureaucracy at the beginning of his career. He retired early so that he could spend a lot of his life uncovering the archaeology of Spain. He is a great contributor to the Catalogo Monumental de España, which has a series of archaeological finds from Spain. So he was the first person that created a systematic study and synthesis of Andalusian material and culture in Spain. And another important figure, because it came from two ways. we have Pascal de Gayangos. And Pascal de Gayangos also was a figure that, and he's mainly known for translating a very important document of Islamic history in Spain by a 17th century North African named al-Maqari, who wrote a compilation of different medieval historians of Spain, of North African Muslims. It's an Arabic manuscript that he wrote in the 17th century, which gives us a comprehensive history of al-Andalus and Muslim Spain. And what is important about this book, which is named Nafhut Tib, or the essence of perfume, is that, or the I don't want to say the smell of perfume, but there's a better word for it, the scent of perfume. There we go. And so Gayangos trained with another Arabist named Jose Antonio Kahn, who had written a book called The Historia de la Dominación de los Árabes en España, the history of the domination of the Arabs in Spain. Now, Kahn had trouble actually getting access to Nafhut Tib or Maqari's work in Spain. The monks of Escorial were just, at the time, very cautious and very suspicious of anybody trying to work on Arabic sources. So Kahn also had to go to Europe and find copies, and he tried to get copies of this book to translate, to put in his own work, but actually he wrote this entire work on the history of the domination of Arabs in Spain without actually reading this book. And so Gayangos took it upon himself to finally produce a translation. But he got frustrated with the parochialism that he was facing in Spain. I think many of us academics face that in all of our institutions today as well. So it's just a repetition of history no matter what. But he published, so he actually goes to Europe. Gayangos, he was married to an English woman, and he uses that benefit to actually get funding in Europe to translate this book. So instead of translating it in Spanish, he translates it in English. It is a great book. It's 3 volumes. It was published in 1820. And this book basically caught the imagination of Europeans because it had vivid descriptions of Madinat al-Zahra. And it talked about the mercury pools and the marble walls and the beauty of Madinat al-Zahra. So as a result, Madinat al-Zahra became a legendary romanticized city, much like Atlantis or Thebes at the time. And so it caught the attention of archaeologists, and Gayangos, with a friend named Pedro de Madrazo, were able to go around Spain and actually search for the location of Madinat al-Zahra, because since the civil war that happened in the beginning of the 11th century, nobody knew where it was. And so they take the translation, they use the information that has been put forward in this translation, and they are able to locate Madinat al-Zahra. Unfortunately, they find it, and then they find pieces here and there, but the owner is kind of, he's not very happy with them being on his land because it's pastoral land. And Gayangos writes later, like in frustration, he says, quote, "It is a pity that the landowner did not even dedicate a small portion of that which he spends in building plaster palaces in Madrid to these excavations that we wanted to do, from which history and the sciences would gain so much." But what this revisiting through scholarship did was create a movement. So we do see the artistic tradition, and we also have to thank Owen Jones at the beginning for his publication on the Alhambra, for creating this movement and nostalgia for the Islamic past of Spain. And as a result, half a century later, in 1910, the first excavations of Madinat al-Zahra went underway by Velázquez Bosco. They were problematic. People were just interested in the full pieces of stucco and not the little fragments. It wasn't as organized as it could have been, but it has evolved in the last century. And this is where I would like to leave us today. Thank you for being my partner in crime and for accompanying me on this journey as we sat and discussed among the ruins, architecture, art of Islamic Spain. I do hope that you gained something from these sessions, and I would like to thank you for your attentiveness, your passion, your questions, and for being here every day. I feel like I know all of you very well now, and I hope in the future we can continue this exploration and